You won't believe what happened when an HOA Karen tried to tear down my grandmother's cottage. Too bad, she had a secret weapon that turned the tables. But before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. It all began in the small, picturesque town of Oakwood Hills, a place where everyone knew everyone, and change came slowly. For generations, my family had owned a charming little cottage at the edge of town, nestled between towering pine trees and nestled beside a tranquil lake that mirrored the sky above. This cottage, built in the early 1900s, had been passed down through the generations. It was more than just a vacation home or a summer getaway. It was a living piece of family history, a place where my grandmother, Margaret, had spent every summer since her childhood. I remember visiting her as a child, running barefoot through the lush fields, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and pine. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where every corner held a story, every nook a memory. The porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze, the old stone fireplace that had warmed many winters, and the oversized oak tree in the backyard, which my siblings and I used as the perfect climbing tree. These were the things that made the cottage special. But in recent years, something had begun to change in Oakwood Hills. New people moved in, young families, professionals, and retirees from the city, bringing with them a different vision of what the neighborhood should look like. In response to this influx of newcomers, the town council decided to form a Homeowners Association, or HOA, to oversee the aesthetic upkeep of the neighborhood. At first, it seemed harmless enough, a set of rules that would ensure everyone kept their lawns tidy and painted their houses in shades that were appropriate for the area. But as time passed, the HOA began to take on a life of its own, enforcing increasingly restrictive regulations that didn't just impact new properties, but also targeted long-established homes like my grandmother's. The HOA board was led by a woman named Karen, a former city planner with a rather rigid and inflexible view of how things should be. To her, anything that didn't adhere to her vision of suburban perfection was an eyesore. She quickly earned the reputation of being a Karen, a term used in the neighborhood to describe her self-righteous attitude and the way she felt entitled to meddle in everyone else's affairs. Under her leadership, the HOA's reach expanded. It wasn't just about keeping lawns trimmed anymore. No, the HOA now had a list of rules that extended to every inch of a property. The exact shade of green for the grass, the allowable height for hedges, the permitted number of flower beds, and even the type of tree species allowed to be planted. My grandmother's cottage, with its ivy-covered facade and wild, untamed garden, suddenly became a target. It all started with the first complaint, which arrived one morning in the form of a certified letter from the HOA office. The letter was formal, cold, and to the point. This property does not meet HOA standards and will be fined if these issues are not addressed within 30 days. The list of alleged violations was long, citing everything from the paint color on the house, a faded blue-gray that had been there for as long as anyone could remember, to the fact that the rose bushes along the side of the house were too overgrown and not in line with HOA landscaping guidelines. At first, my grandmother laughed it off. "I've lived here for 60 years, and no one has ever complained about my roses," she muttered as she placed the letter on the kitchen counter. But the HOA didn't let up. Within weeks, another letter arrived, this time warning that a fine of $500 would be imposed if the issues weren't resolved. My grandmother shook her head in disbelief. "What do they expect me to do?" she asked, staring at the letter. "Pull up the roses and plant some boring shrubbery? That's not how I've always done things." It was clear that she wasn't going to just roll over, but the letters kept coming, each more aggressive than the last. Soon, the fines were doubled, and a notice was issued that if the violations weren't addressed, the HOA would seek legal action. Then, one afternoon, Karen herself showed up unannounced at the cottage. Wearing a crisp blazer and a pair of sunglasses, she knocked on the door with an air of authority. My grandmother opened the door, her expression polite but cautious. "Hello, Margaret," Karen said with a forced smile. "I just wanted to personally visit you to ensure that you're aware of the HOA's concerns regarding your property." She didn't wait for an invitation to enter, stepping past my grandmother into the foyer. I'm afraid this garden of yours is simply too wild. You'll need to trim back these trees here, she said, pointing at the towering oaks that shaded the yard. And the flower beds? They're just too much. We need to make sure your property reflects the community standards. My grandmother's face reddened. This garden has been here longer than you have, Karen, she replied, her voice steady but firm. And these trees are part of the charm of the place. They keep it cool in the summer and beautiful in the fall. You can't just tell me to rip them out. But Karen was not one to back down easily. The HOA board has decided that these changes are necessary for the good of the community, she said, as though she were delivering an edict from on high. If you don't comply with these requests, the HOA will have no choice but to fine you, and, if necessary, take legal action. I suggest you start making arrangements. It was at that moment that the realization hit my grandmother. This wasn't just about a garden or a few trees. The HOA was on a mission to transform the neighborhood, to sanitize it, to turn it into a place where nothing stood out and nothing was too unique. They wanted conformity above all else, and my grandmother's beloved cottage, with its old-world charm, was a glaring example of everything they didn't want. But my grandmother, as stubborn as she was, wasn't about to let someone take away the one place that had meant everything to her. She sent a firm response to the HOA's letters, rejecting their demands and vowing to fight back. Little did she know that this would set off a chain of events that would change everything. After months of escalating tension between my grandmother and the HOA, things took a dramatic turn. The pressure from Karen and the board became unbearable. At first, we thought it was a mere nuisance, annoying, but something that could be managed. My grandmother, ever the strong-willed woman, refused to be intimidated. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. She had power, influence, and a clear vision of how she wanted the neighborhood to look, and my grandmother's property, with its mismatched shutters and unruly vines, simply didn't fit into that vision. It wasn't long before the HOA took their threats from words to action. One morning, as my grandmother was sipping her coffee in the sunroom, a certified letter arrived. This one was different from the rest. It wasn't a fine or another notice demanding that she trim her trees or remove her flower beds. This letter was a legal summons. The HOA, under Karen's direction, was suing my grandmother for failing to comply with the HOA's rules. The letter stated that if she didn't make the necessary changes to her property within 30 days, the HOA would take her to court. This was no longer a simple dispute over landscaping. This had become a full-fledged legal battle. The first time I saw my grandmother after she opened the letter, she was sitting in her favorite chair, staring at it with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "They can't just do this," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter, but her voice was steady. "They think they can bully me into changing my home? Well, they're wrong." We gathered around the kitchen table that evening, my grandmother, my parents, and me, to discuss our options. My grandmother was determined not to let Karen and the HOA get away with this. "They think they can just force me out," she said with fire in her eyes. "But I've lived here all my life, and no one's going to push me around." The thought of legal action unnerved me. I wasn't sure if we could afford a prolonged legal battle, or if we had the resources to stand up to the HOA's deep pockets. But my grandmother's resolve was unshakable. She insisted on fighting back. As the days passed, the tension in Oakwood Hills grew thicker. Karen had made it clear that she wouldn't back down, and neither would we. It wasn't just about a cottage. It was about the principle of the matter. My grandmother's pride in her home, the years of memories, and the love she had for this place were on the line. The idea of letting some overzealous HOA bully her into submission wasn't something she could accept. Then, one evening, as we were discussing our next steps, a surprising revelation occurred. My grandmother had been rummaging through some old papers in her attic, looking for legal documents related to her property, when she came across something unusual. Buried beneath decades of dust and forgotten receipts, she found an old file containing the deed to the cottage and some correspondence from decades ago. Upon closer inspection, she discovered something that made her eyes widen. My grandmother, as it turned out, had a very unusual connection to the very legal system that the HOA was relying on to pursue this case. It was in that moment that my grandmother revealed something that changed everything. "I never told you this," she began, "but I've had a few roles over the years that I never really talked about. One of them was that I served as the assistant to the district attorney many years ago, and later on, I even worked on a few legal cases." My jaw dropped. I had no idea. I had always known her as the loving grandmother who baked cookies and told stories, but I never knew that she had a background in law. It turned out that my grandmother had worked her way through law school in her youth, and had even been involved in significant legal cases when she was younger. It had been years since she practiced law, but there was one thing that stood out. My grandmother had connections, powerful ones. But that wasn't the most startling discovery. As we continued to sift through the old papers, it became clear that my grandmother's legal expertise wasn't just something she had left behind in the past. She had become the state attorney general of our state many years ago, a role she had served in before retiring to the quiet life of cottage living. My grandmother had been in charge of overseeing all legal matters in the state. She was the one who had held the power to shape the law, to decide what was right and what was wrong. And as the state attorney general, she had made connections with some of the most influential legal minds in the country. I couldn't believe it. The woman who had been quietly tending her garden and enjoying her retirement had been a legal powerhouse, and not just any legal professional, but someone who had been at the top of the legal world. As I stared at her, trying to process everything she had just revealed, she smiled and said, "I may have retired from the big world of law, but that doesn't mean I don't still know how to play the game." With this newfound information, my grandmother was no longer the underdog. The tables had turned. Karen, the HOA board, and their legal team might have been a powerful force in Oakwood Hills, but they were about to face a woman who not only understood the law, but had helped shape it. My grandmother, the former state attorney general, wasn't just fighting to keep her property. She was now in a position to dismantle the HOA's case from the inside out. My grandmother immediately reached out to some of her old colleagues from her time in office. She called in favors, and soon we had a team of legal experts, some of the best in the state, ready to fight on our side. The board, led by Karen, had no idea what they were up against. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable, elderly woman who didn't have the resources to fight back. They had no idea that they were about to be taken down by one of the most powerful legal minds the state had ever seen. The first step was to file a counterclaim, challenging the validity of the HOA's rules and the legality of their enforcement. My grandmother's legal team discovered that many of the HOA's rules were, in fact, vague and poorly written, and in several instances, they were in violation of state regulations. My grandmother had long ago learned that the key to winning a legal battle wasn't just about fighting back. It was about finding the loopholes, the mistakes, and using them to your advantage. As the weeks passed and the case moved forward, the HOA board, and Karen in particular, began to feel the pressure. What had started as a simple lawsuit over property violations was now turning into a public spectacle. News outlets picked up the story of the former state attorney general taking on the local HOA, and soon, the entire community of Oakwood Hills was watching. People who had once sided with Karen and the HOA began to question their motives. Some residents started to wonder if Karen was truly acting in the best interests of the community, or if she was just using her position for personal gain. Meanwhile, my grandmother's team worked tirelessly to build their case, and as the trial date neared, the HOA's case started to unravel. The legal arguments they had relied on began to fall apart, and their threats of fines and forced compliance started to lose their power. My grandmother's experience, her connections, and her deep knowledge of the law had turned the tide. Karen, for the first time, began to realize that she was no longer in control. My grandmother, once again, had shown that she would never back down, no matter how much pressure was put on her. The HOA had underestimated her, and they were about to pay the price for their mistake. The legal battle that had begun with a simple letter from the HOA had now escalated into a full-fledged showdown. With my grandmother at the helm of her legal team, the tide of battle had shifted in our favor. Karen, once so confident in her ability to control the neighborhood with her iron grip, was now on the defensive. The trial was set to take place in the town's small courthouse, a place that had seen many cases over the years, but never one quite like this. News outlets, local and state, had picked up on the story, and for the first time in years, the small town of Oakwood Hills was under the spotlight. As the day of the trial drew closer, the atmosphere in Oakwood Hills became charged with anticipation. The courthouse, typically a place of quiet, mundane legal proceedings, was now filled with reporters, residents, and curious onlookers. People who had once sided with the HOA now stood divided. Neighbors who had lived next to my grandmother for decades began to question Karen's motives. Had the HOA been too harsh in its demands? Were they overstepping their authority? The once quiet town had been thrown into a whirlwind of legal battles, public opinions, and shifting allegiances. Karen, realizing the gravity of the situation, tried everything in her power to intimidate my grandmother into settling. There were numerous settlement offers, each one more tempting than the last. The HOA offered to drop all charges if my grandmother simply agreed to make the necessary changes to her property, but my grandmother refused every time. "This is not about landscaping," she told me one evening, her voice firm. "This is about standing up for what's right. I've lived here my whole life, and no one is going to take my home away from me." In the days leading up to the trial, we prepared for the final showdown. My grandmother's legal team was sharp, and every argument they presented was backed by years of experience and a deep understanding of both state law and HOA regulations. The team had dug deep into the HOA's rules and found several instances where the HOA had not only violated its own bylaws, but had also acted outside the scope of its legal authority. Karen's arrogance had led her to ignore the limitations of her power, and now it was coming back to haunt her. On the morning of the trial, we arrived at the courthouse to a flurry of activity. Reporters were gathered outside, snapping photos and interviewing residents who had gathered to watch. The courtroom itself was small, with wooden pews lining the sides and a few rows of seats reserved for the public. My grandmother, ever composed, walked in confidently, her head held high. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, and as Karen and her legal team walked in, there was a noticeable shift in the room. It was clear that they didn't expect a fight like this. They had thought they were dealing with an elderly woman, a woman who would cave under the pressure. But they hadn't counted on the fact that my grandmother was no ordinary woman. She wasn't just a retired grandmother. She was a former state attorney general, a woman with a sharp mind and a fierce determination to protect her legacy. As the trial began, Karen's legal team made their opening arguments. They painted a picture of a property that was in disrepair, claiming that my grandmother's cottage was not only an eyesore, but a safety hazard for the community. They argued that the HOA had a right to enforce its rules and regulations, and that my grandmother's refusal to comply was not just a violation of the HOA's guidelines, but a challenge to the very fabric of the community. The arguments were predictable, filled with vague assertions about the importance of uniformity and the need for conformity. But then, it was my grandmother's turn. The courtroom fell silent as her legal team presented their case. My grandmother, sitting at the front, was calm and composed as her attorney made the opening statement. "This case," he said, addressing the judge, "is not just about a garden or the color of a house. This case is about the right to live freely in one's own home. It's about standing up to an organization that has overstepped its boundaries and imposed arbitrary rules that violate state laws. My client, Mrs. Margaret Collins, has lived in her home for over 60 years. She is not just an ordinary homeowner. She is a person whose life and history are intertwined with this property. The HOA's demands are not only unreasonable, but they are also illegal." The first witness to be called was my grandmother herself. She took the stand, and the room was captivated by her presence. She wasn't the frail, elderly woman that Karen had thought she was. Instead, she was a woman with years of experience, wisdom, and knowledge that had only grown sharper with time. As she spoke, her voice resonated with the authority of someone who had once been at the top of the legal world. She detailed the history of the cottage, explaining how it had been in her family for generations. She spoke of the memories, the love, and the sacrifices that had been made to keep it in the family. And she explained why she would never let anyone take that away from her. Karen's legal team tried to undermine my grandmother's testimony, but their efforts fell flat. Every time they questioned her, my grandmother responded with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years in the courtroom. She wasn't just defending her property. She was defending the right of every individual to live their life without fear of oppressive rules and regulations. She spoke of the importance of preserving the uniqueness of communities, of honoring the history and traditions that made places like Oakwood Hills special. As the trial wore on, Karen's case began to unravel. My grandmother's legal team introduced key evidence that demonstrated how the HOA had violated its own rules. They presented testimony from experts who explained that the HOA's enforcement actions had been arbitrary and capricious, targeting specific homeowners without justification. They showed how the HOA had failed to properly notify residents of rule changes and how many of the rules they had imposed were vague and unenforceable. It became clear that the HOA had overstepped its authority, and Karen's reign of control was beginning to crumble. The final moment of the trial came when the judge delivered his verdict. He ruled in favor of my grandmother, stating that the HOA had indeed overstepped its bounds and had violated state law by enforcing arbitrary rules without proper legal justification. The judge ordered that the fines against my grandmother be dropped, and he issued an injunction preventing the HOA from continuing their efforts to force her to make changes to her property. But the victory didn't just stop there. The judge also ordered that the HOA board undergo a review of their rules and practices to ensure that future enforcement actions would comply with state regulations. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in applause. My grandmother had won, not just for herself, but for the entire community. Karen's reign was over. The once powerful HOA board had been forced to reconsider its actions, and the power dynamic in Oakwood Hills had shifted forever. In the days that followed, my grandmother's victory became a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. The HOA, once a force of authority in the neighborhood, now found itself under scrutiny from residents who had once been too afraid to question its actions. Karen, defeated and humiliated, resigned from her position on the board, and the HOA's control over the neighborhood began to loosen. As for my grandmother, she returned to her cottage, content in the knowledge that she had fought for what was hers and had triumphed. The roses bloomed once more, and the trees stood tall, just as they had for decades. My grandmother had not only protected her home, she had sent a powerful message to the entire community. Never underestimate the power of standing firm for what you believe in.